Welcome to today's episode of Think Tank, where we explore the art of negotiating once again, but this time French style. The culture that mastered diplomacy, gastronomy, and making no sound so elegant that it actually feels like a compliment. Today, we're diving into how the French think, talk, and negotiate, and why the rest of us around the world are still trying to keep up. Negotiation, as I've often said, is misunderstood. It's not really about conflict, it's about aligning perspectives. You may think you're being clear, they may interpret things differently. Assumptions that we make can derail negotiations more than actual disagreement. Everyone brings their biases, prejudices, cultural habits into our discussions. Success actually comes from understanding an approach and putting aside your own assumptions in a negotiation. So, this podcast is all about bridging cultures, specifically negotiating with the French. France is one of those few places where negotiations are like intellectual sparring. And one thing I've always noticed in France is that whilst conversations can stay very polite, people say no quite openly, they push back, and there is a slightly different rhythm of how people speak and how people behave with you. And once you stop judging and once you stop thinking about this too much, you can actually enjoy that kind of, as I said, can mean that everyone can get their priorities met and everyone can have criteria that they're working towards that can lead to a successful outcome. Today's guest is Salwa. Salwa is actually part of our very own Think team. Salwa was born and brought up in France, and she joined our team to work in our luxury and fashion sector, but ended up doing everything else that gets thrown at her, which is the case in a small law firm. But Salwa's experiences as a French speaker in the UAE and someone who is bridging so many cultures with her Moroccan roots, coming from a French background, working in a Middle East country, is really some interesting insights for you and me to learn from. Thank you so much once again for listening to and watching our podcast, Think Tank. So, one of the reasons at Think Tank we do these podcasts is because we live in a city like Dubai where we often interact in 1 week with 60 different nationalities, and we have to kind of break down the cultural code of why we're interacting, how we're interacting, pick up the body language cues. And as lawyers, there are lots of nuances and aspects of dealing with a client and interacting with a client. So, coming back to you, Salwa, tell us about your experiences being French in the legal industry in Dubai. And does it work? Does it not work? Do people get you? Do they not get you?
So before landing in Dubai, I spent a semester in Beirut, in Lebanon. I had an internship in the corporate department of a law firm in Casablanca, Morocco. And I also had a few internships here and there in Paris. And then right before landing in Dubai, actually, I was almost 2 years in Cairo, in Egypt, in the arbitration department of a law firm. So I came in Dubai with that luggage of experiences and with all my young arrogance. And I was like, okay, I can adjust to this environment, right? Well, life humbled me a lot. Because actually, what's interesting is that you can't talk about one environment in Dubai. There are many environments, there are as many people as environments, and you need to adjust to each one of them. So it's a double, triple, quadruple exercise that you need to do. It's really a lot of efforts actually not to have assumptions. And by the way, thank you for doing this exercise of trying to understand our culture and trying to break these assumptions that we're all having to other cultures. So definitely it's an interesting exercise, but it's definitely a lot of efforts to make to adjust to absolutely each and every environment here.
But so you're one of those lucky French people who've had exposure to Beirut, to kind of a Lebanese style of working, which is sort of quasi French, of course. And then obviously Morocco, where your roots come from, and Egypt, which is completely a different ballgame. So tell us from an educational perspective, when you're a young person in France, how do they train you? Like we know the American system, we've talked about how out there you need to be in the American system. Tell me a little bit about the French education system and how it possibly shaped your communication skills.
So that's a very interesting question. First of all, what comes in my mind is the hierarchy, professor, student. So there's a lot of formalities. And even in the French language, you wouldn't say tu. So in you, for example, there is only you. You can say you to your mother, you to the professor. It's a one you. In French, there is a tu and there is the vous. So you always say vous to a professor. So you
Like more formal.
Exactly. A lot of formalities. For example, lawyers are not called, you wouldn't say in France, je suis. You would say maître, which means master, which is,
I like that. Feel free to call me that anytime.
but that is true, you're mastering, right? So you're an actual master. So a lot of formalities, a lot of distanced. So that's the first thing. The second thing is definitely the structure. We are taught to be analytical for sure. Like, for example, the dissertation, la dissertation, which is a very famous exercise specifically in law, the structure, the plan, the first paragraph and then the second paragraph, the introduction needs to be extra carefully drafted, like the first sentence to catch the audience, and then the definition needs to be very precise of whatever. For example, the dissertation would be about the good faith. Like, you need to talk and write a lot about the good faith, and the first part, for example, would be the definition and the theoretical side of it, what the legislator was thinking behind good faith. And then second part would be all the nuances and all the caveats and all the disclaimers. So it's extremely structured. And I have to say that now, specifically in the legal field, even when you ask me random questions, even in a friendly setting, I think like that. I
Try to break it.
exactly, and I'm actually frustrated when I go everywhere in my speech and I'm not structured and I'm not organized and I'm not nuanced, because life is not dark and white.
Yeah.
Life is gray.
I mean, you raise a good question. And coming back to law, what about the fact that France is a civil law country?
Yeah.
We've talked in other podcasts about the differences between civil law and common law. Obviously, civil law translates really well into UAE, which is also a civil law country, apart from the DIFC and the ADGM that practice common law. But tell us about your civil law experience and about the fact that in the UAE, you don't have binding precedent in the courts.
True.
Can you contrast what you see in the UAE with what you see in France?
So basically, the judges look obviously at the precedents and they're influenced by it, but they also look at the law. And it's like a practical exercise from the judges to actually adjust to the reality of the situation, which is kind of the same thing in the UAE. And that's why I would say I relate to that and it's very familiar to me, you know?
Yes, I mean the UAE civil law is based on the Napoleonic codes.
Exactly.
So I guess it translates very, very easily for you.
Exactly.
But then when it comes to people and negotiation styles, let's say you're a French person dealing with non-French individuals or people in your clients who are non-French. How do you break down those barriers with your expectation of having an analytical kind of outlook, with giving the right answers, having structure? Most people from a lot of other cultures don't really have that structure.
Definitely. Like Americans, for example, I always admire how spontaneous they are. They might not necessarily all the time have the self-pressure of being all the time analytical, yet they would perfectly answer your question and they would go to the point. They're straight to the point. They will just like have a blunt statement that actually answers your response. And I love that, how spontaneous people could be here in Dubai. And I look up to them in a way, and I try sometimes, and specifically nowadays where contracts are pages and pages, like, no, it's not necessarily client friendly. We've really tried to go to the point and be straight to the point. So I'm trying also to change this French influence of drafting a lot and be super precise. And sometimes you have to be client friendly. You have to go to the point.
Yeah.
And
Well, more and more with like lots of clients generating AI contracts and asking us to review ChatGPT contracts, which is somewhat frustrating, but never mind. And you have to rewrite it, but you have to kind of make the client feel like you're not rewriting their AI version.
Exactly.
You're trying to add value to the process.
Definitely.
Yeah.
You trying to adjust to a lot of things, and specifically in Dubai, it's definitely, as I said, a lot of efforts, a lot of exercise.
So let's talk about a few examples. As I mentioned, we do a lot of fashion and luxury work, which Salwa is involved with as well at the firm. We sometimes have situations where a French client might be negotiating a contract with, say, a UAE distributor.
Yeah.
The distributor could be, of course, Emirati or Lebanese or any of these nationalities where they have a local presence, they have very good local roots and lots of stores, because we do a lot of retail-related work. So what would you say are the things to watch out for? If I was the distributor and you were the French brand working with me, what are the tricks of the trade? What is the French brand looking to win in this negotiation?
Oh, so first of all, they would obviously don't expect the transaction to be closed on the spot. Do not rush any decision. You need time, you need patience, and specifically, what's a podcast for the French human being if I'm not criticizing French administration? So I will obviously criticize French administration. When you're dealing with a French client or with a French party, you can't rush decisions because you need to go through French administration. Example, we're currently dealing with 2 clients notarizing a document in France, and it's actually taking more than 1 month. And I can see both parties, including our client, being actually discouraged and frustrated. So you need to deal with that.
Can you explain why the document has to be notarized?
Oh, it's very important because it's a formality. So basically in the UAE, you would need to validate the document in France first. And just the process of validation in France for the UAE to recognize the document, you would absolutely need to pass through that notarization process in France, which includes a lot of
Steps.
formalities. Yeah.
Right, right. And I mean, what about all the holidays that the French take?
There are a lot. We love holidays. They're the fruit of a lot of protests. So we care a lot about them. But it's also, again, frustrating. For example, we're having counterparties in France who are deliberately taking holidays, like Christmas holidays and everything. They're closed in Christmas. The last 2 weeks of December will be dead. August, they're completely closed.
Yeah.
You cannot reach out. They wouldn't be answering. So it could be frustrating, obviously.
So this is what I've never understood. Like all the time that lawyers in France take off, because obviously a lot of our counterparties are also lawyers of clients. But when you look at French law firms, they are one of the hardest. I mean, White Nights was created in Paris, where basically you worked through the night, through the week, through seven nights in a row.
Right,
So
yeah.
how is that sort of like that hard work ethic
Exactly.
reconciled with all this sort of holidays? I mean, I don't understand.
It seems paradoxical, but actually we work hard whenever we need to work hard, than holidays.
Like smart work smart.
Exactly. Which is, I don't know, paradoxical, yeah.
Yeah.
Here, I feel like it's more constant. You don't take, I mean, actually, I was kind of surprised at the amount of holidays here with the heat holiday, and but with obviously no country competes with France.
We've noticed that. So coming back to my French client and distributor example, what are the things that we should be watching out for? One is, of course, take your time with the French.
Yes.
Obviously, it's different from what we did on the Chinese podcast, where my guests were saying that let's be friends, build trust, etc.
Yeah.
I haven't really found that I need to build trust with a French person because they've checked me out before they hired me.
Exactly. But I would say you definitely need to be convincing still. You need to give them a lot of examples. You need to persuade them. You need to convince them. And they're very demanding. They're actually demanding. They would question absolutely everything. They need to be convinced because a French citizen cannot rely on a trust me bro. You absolutely need to be convincing. And that also takes a lot of time. You need to be structured in your speech. You need to also respect the formality. That's extremely important. So it's very coded, I would say. The French culture is kind of coded. It has his advantage and his disadvantages, I would say. But you really need to make that effort to actually
Embed himself in the relationship. Right. Right. And what about the fact that sometimes when I've had a French client and they've kind of disagreed with me, but they haven't told me they've really disagreed, they've just disappeared. Yeah, they disappeared for like a couple weeks.
Yes.
And then they bring me back like a 1-page document or sometimes a 2-page document from another law firm that sometimes I'd never heard of, which offends me because obviously I think I'm this amazing practitioner who has like 3 decades of experience in the UAE or whatever. And then I have to kind of like basically eat humble pie, review this other opinion. So tell me a little bit about that. Why do French people ghost you when they don't necessarily agree with your opinion?
Because I would say it's part of the culture. Like, for example, instead of saying, I remember a professor, Professor Vincent Wauquiez, he used to destroy us and be extremely mad at us whenever we tell him in an email, bien cordialement, because there are absolutely no cordiality between the student and his professor. We would say, je vous prie d'agréer, monsieur le professeur, l'expression de ma considération la plus distinguée. I beg you to accept the expression of my most distinguished consideration. So there is a lot of respect. There is a lot of formalities that should be eyes between us. So I can't tell you no, like a harsh no. It's very disrespectful. I don't feel like French are actually that aggressive, so
I see now. So I shouldn't dance.
Sicily at all, diplomatic. It's part of French diplomacy is really something important. You have to walk on eggs, and it's all about being subtle and diplomatic, and I actually like that. It's a way also to respect you. Now, obviously, you would probably wait for an aggressive no. Like, be clear with me, be straight to the point. Sometimes it's actually needed, specifically in business.
I like diplomacy. I'm reminded of that.
Or sometimes it can actually get frustrating. I get that. Like, I need a response. I also have work, I have clients. Like, please go straight to the point. But sometimes, yeah, when you deal with French, like, they're very diplomatic, they walk on eggs, and they also need time. Maybe they needed that time to actually think and come back to.
Yeah, sometimes I feel maybe my responses to them are too complex. Not in a complex way that they don't understand, but maybe I haven't broken it down in a client-friendly manner, exactly what you're saying. Like I haven't been analytical enough, perhaps, for their liking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it true or not? Or is it a myth that French people like people who speak French and they really don't want to speak any other languages? I mean, in France, yes, okay, fine. You have to like...
Of course. Yeah, of course. And again, it's part of the game. You need to do efforts to come to our French. They appreciate that. We appreciate a lot of effort being made towards us to reach us. So obviously, if you speak French, they would absolutely appreciate that. And that's why advice to foreign lawyers, maybe when they're dealing with French, obviously respect the formalities, etc., but break the ice and actually try to make that step towards them to like talk a bit in French and maybe making them joke, and that's part of the game. So yeah, definitely they always appreciate that.
Great. So one of my other experiences, obviously, with French clients has been that they're very eloquent, even if they do ghost me sometimes. When they do speak to me and they are interacting with us, they're very eloquent. How is that such a natural French thing? How do they just have this ability?
I admire that, honestly, and I'm very proud to have this background. So basically, I don't know if it's specific to the legal field, to be extremely honest, but you would see a lot of legal counsel be super well-spoken. Why? Because in French universities, I wouldn't say you have to go through eloquent contests, but it's a very, very highly encouraged option. So for me, first year, background, I'm extremely shy, extreme introvert. So I wanted to challenge myself, and actually my professor told me, hey, Salwa, you absolutely need to go to eloquent contests. You will see a clear change. So I tried. First time, humiliation, obviously, public humiliation. And I had this question, toute vérité est-elle bonne à dire? Is truth always worth telling? And sometimes you would have like jokes whenever you have like topic. Like, for example, does money talk or whisper? Like this type of super interesting topic. And the other interesting thing is that obviously to all of these questions, there is never a yes, never a no. It's always, it depends.
It's nuanced, as you said.
Exactly. Yeah. But the game is that you're put in a yes position or a no position, and then you have to argue against your...
So like debating society.
Exactly. Okay. Super interesting. And so my personal touch, so obviously you can joke, it has to be structured. That's the thing. You have to be convincing for sure. But then you can obviously have your own personal thing. And I'm not necessarily into joking with the audience. I feel like it's a bit like cringy or embarrassing. It's a lot. You're never sure. You're never too sure. So I was like, okay, I'll absolutely adore French poetry. So I'll make my speech rhyme. So I structured my arguments, my plea around this. And I thought, well, it will sound like a music. So the audience might think, well, the content is true because it's like an emotional kind of trick where because you're eloquent, because you make everything rhyme, then maybe the content is actually not that wrong.
That's very clever.
Exactly. And eloquence is part of that. When you're eloquent, the content can be absolutely... excuse me the term, BS. Completely wrong. But because you're eloquent, you will catch the audience and they'll at least listen to you. So that's probably why you meet a lot of French legal counsel being that eloquent. And now I'm actually mentoring French students. I tell them, obviously, do your homework and be super serious and go to classes. But please do elocution contests. It will change how you communicate.
But that's not very different about what you said about Americans, because in the American system, obviously, they're also doing a lot of public speaking and communication courses, peer counseling. I did that when I was in high school. Okay. I had to counsel other peers going through difficult mental health issues and things like that, which is a big burden as a 17-year-old to be counseling other 17-year-olds. But it gives you that power to grow and communicate because you literally have that... You're holding somebody else's sort of emotional structure, emotional responsibility. I don't know what you call it. So that's not that different from the Americans. So the French are not that far off in terms of, it's just the way they present themselves.
Exactly. I'm glad you found probably the first common point between American and French. That doesn't happen often.
But tell me about social life and social graces, because, for example, I don't socialize as much with my French clients simply because I do bear the formality and I have the distance. But every time we finish a deal, we sign a new contract, we go out for an amazing meal and we hang out, and most of them talk French and I'm just buckling along, using my very broken French to speak to them. But tell me about the social side of French culture.
No, social life is probably more active than Dubai. I feel like in Dubai, it's the country in workplaces, it would be super easy to network and to connect with the other. And probably because it's a very fast-paced business environment. So we're encouraging that, you know. In France, I would say it's the contrary. Like in workplace, we're all very serious, distance, formality, maître, bonjour, merci, au revoir, attention, a lot of formalities. When that's done, we celebrate. I would completely agree with that. Yeah, we celebrate a lot. Specifically, I have to say, I studied in south of France. It's another level
of celebration.
Yes. Yes. And I love that. That's the whole
balance.
Yeah.
So what about like things you should never do? Biggest faux pas. What is it that I should be avoiding if I do not want to be cancelled by the French?
I would say never oversimplify something. You want to be client friendly and that's amazing, but do not oversimplify your arguments because you would sound as not convincing and as non really like professional. You're not having any experience. So like I need to say something and put a lot of caveats to it. Yes, be structured. Yes, be analytical. Yes, be at the same time client friendly, but like do not oversimplify also your argument. So try to balance maybe, and even I would say when I'm saying about all of this distance and formalities you need to put between you and the client, I also have to put a nuance and a caveat to that. There was actually a study from the La Revue Française d'Économie et Gestion, a very recent one from 2025. We assume that French consumers are technical buyers, but they're also emotional buyers. And so you need to put emotions also in your speech and how you communicate with French. So don't be robotic, stay human, obviously. And it's always good to joke about Paris and holidays and protests and what's going on in France. And God knows France is a very entertaining country. Lots happening, specifically recently.
Well, I see your point about the emotion, you know, with Hermes being the top luxury brand for God knows how long to come.
Yeah.
And it's that connection. It's iconic, and it's that whole feeling of owning something from the brand.
Definitely. Yes, I would say so. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And any more faux pas that you could think of?
Don't have any assumptions. Like I since I'm in Dubai, I heard so many assumptions that French are arrogant and French are rude and French are slow. Well, they can be slow, specifically business-wise, because again, we're dealing with the government, administration. Sorry to criticize again, but yeah, do not have any assumptions. Like, and that's why I love the series you're doing on the podcast. Like, you're really trying to break these assumptions and actually explain the reason why French are French, and how they have these mindset and personality. And
to me, the biggest learning for me during the podcast has also been the fact that every nationality I've been talking to and every culture I've been talking to are so human and so humorous.
Oh, really?
So they all see the funny side of their own culture. Exactly. And obviously being Indian, it's very easy to make fun of Indian things.
Yeah.
But it's not, you can't obviously make fun of other nationalities and think that's not okay.
Yeah.
So I find the fact that when they come in and when, like, for example, talking to you, I could so easily do a transaction with you. I could so easily find a way to break the ice and communicate with you. Yeah. And I could so easily find like a common ground to convince you of my arguments or whatever, because now I got to know you a little bit.
Exactly.
I got to know how maybe you think a little bit. I got to know the culture you came from, which is the very reason I think it's important to break that down. And then I can take my business or my personal relationship with somebody like you forward. So that's what I've learned, really, is like everyone's actually, you can appeal to them from an emotional and a human perspective, and everyone thinks of the same bottom line.
exactly.
In business, I feel no matter what nationality you are, you're looking for what are the benefits that I can achieve, right? I don't necessarily need to win this negotiation. I don't need to win every battle. What I need to do is I have a bunch of things I need to achieve. How do I achieve those? And how does this cross-cultural interaction work? Like, how do I make it work?
Yeah, exactly. It's always nice, obviously, to have tricks about, okay, well, I know why this French client is not coming back to me. Like, you have a background, but obviously, like, never have strong assumptions. And as you said, make the efforts, like, go to that client, go to that counterparty, make the first step and break the ice, kind of, and just to make the relationship smooth.
Yeah, I mean, to me as well, I think this is another question for you, but sort of a rhetorical question, because I think for me, some of the French clients I've been working with have been working with me for over 32, 33 years. So they were clients whose businesses I set up, or branches I set up, or one retail store I set up years and years ago, and they kept in touch. And despite me moving countries and things and law firms, again, they kept in touch, and I was lucky enough for them. They instructed me on many different occasions. So to me, I found it's a different kind of friendship. I wouldn't say they treat me as their friend and we're like hanging out and partying on the streets of Paris together, but there is that friendship where there's that trust that has developed over the years. So I value that a lot, and I've seen that more with the French than some of my other clients who may not have had that same longevity in terms of our relationship.
Exactly. Loyalty. French are actually loyal. And even when you see Chanel, when you see Dior, when you see Hermes, it's like Hermes family business, for example, they actually refuse any other shareholder. They stick to each other. And a lot of big families in France, they really stick to each other. Loyalty is really a big thing. So I'm really not surprised that you're having these clients since 30 years. Second thing, obviously, that's because you're excellent. So obviously they would stick to you. So yeah, a combination of both.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think also like from a French perspective, what I've seen in our business, because we're working with so many brands in the perfume industry, in the fashion industry, in the skincare industry, that there are so many maisons and old-fashioned businesses in France that are still doing amazingly because they've kind of held on to their value and they've held on to their quality.
Exactly.
And that's for me like I mean, I don't know how you feel about that, but maybe you can talk about that, why some of the old business houses in France still have such a great ethic and they're able to do so well in a modern world.
That's because the clients are consuming. We're the audience is here. And also what I really like about these maisons, and specifically in the super capitalistic society, is that maisons stick to a story. They have a story behind. They have not only a story, they are history in a way. So that's why they do have an audience. And I don't know about you, and that's probably another topic, but we're always trying to put a bit of sense in whatever we are doing. So you don't want to buy just to buy. You want to buy something that actually has a story and is part of a history. And I think that's also part that, for example, Le Birkin RS has a story. Like,
oh, that's a whole other podcast. We have to do that. Right?
That would actually be super interesting.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah.
But exactly, like, this is part of France, I would say, and that's actually a heritage I absolutely love. That's wealth. France wealth for me is also that.
But from a legal perspective, I also like the fact that they really protect their brand value. Like, for example, the laws in France that restrict you from having any counterfeit products, and the fact that you could be arrested if you were carrying or trading in or doing anything in terms of counterfeit. These trademark laws are existing and do exist in many other countries, but from my recollection and my knowledge, they are most enforced in France.
Oh, definitely strict laws. Even labor law is extremely strict. It has, again, his advantages and its disadvantages. Like, for example, to hire someone, it takes a lot of formalities. To get rid of someone, of course, well, you can't do that on the spot, while in other jurisdictions, it's actually encouraged, because we want to encourage business, and companies shouldn't be afraid to get rid of people because it's part of the business. In France, no, we take care of people. Pays des droits de l'homme, human rights are respected. That's also debatable.
Reason for more protests.
I love it. That's why laws are extremely strict. You're absolutely right. Yes.
Thank you very much. That's very insightful conversation. And we'll be back with another podcast on special luxury products.
I would love to. I would absolutely love to. Yes,
Thank you.
very much. Thank you.